Recording in progress.
First of all, perhaps just say welcome everybody online as well. Sorry for the delay. I think the news has got round that we had a little bit of trouble with the door on the train. But anyway, we're good to go now. So what I'd suggest, obviously, we won't do the initial meditation, but we will do the opening, so the prayers, and then we just get straight into the talk, and then if there's a little bit of time for meditation afterwards, we can do that.
Okay. So what prayers have we got to do? So let's see. I'll go straight into it, and you'll do the time for the four.
Yes.
Thank you. Now I have this unique opportunity of freeing the well-favoured human form so difficult to find. But it will not last forever. Death can come at any moment. And wherever I'm born into samsara, there will be suffering. Virtuous or harmful actions, karma's cause and effect cannot be escaped. Next, the refuge prayer, twice in Tibetan, once in Sangha, I take refuge until enlightenment is reached. Through the virtue generated by this meditation and practice, may I achieve Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings.
Thank you very much. Okay.
So you're very welcome, Martin. We've done the preamble.
We go straight
into it.
Thank you. For today's talk, actually, I'm going to start by reading out a story from this book, which is called The Wisdom of the Zen Masters by Irmgard Schlegel, which was the preordination name of Myokyoni, my late teacher. She trained in Japan between 1960 and 72, returning to Britain. She was actually Austrian by nationality, but she lived most of her life in Britain, and she spent the rest of her life teaching. And this was one of the first books that she did, which was just a collection of sayings, stories, training stories, anecdotes, etc. So we're going to be having, in fact, the last one in this particular book, which goes: An old gentleman came to see Master Tayang for help. He had been chamberlain at court, but was now retired. His children were grown up and married. Recently, his wife had died, and he was desperately lonely. He felt he could no longer cope and had come to see the Master as his last hope. Master Taiyan pondered what could be done. To suggest formal sitting meditation was unlikely to help. Sitting in the stiff formal position through audiences, as the old gentleman had done most of his life, why, he had done enough of this. Should he put him to contemplate nature? Yet however healing that might be, would he, cultured old gentleman that he was, be able to? Thoroughly at home in the vast poetry collection, would not an appropriate verse rise up in his mind and prevent him from the immediacy of seeing? What could be done for him? Then Master Taiyan suggested, go back home, and the next time you feel really desperate, then go into your innermost room, shut the door so that you are all alone and unobserved, and there, without deliberation or thinking of to whom, what for, or why, do 9 full prostrations. Just when you really feel desperate, you can lay yourself down simply with the trust of a little child, for no reason and expecting nothing, and see what happens. Tears were in the old gentleman's eyes as he thanked him and departed. A couple of months later he came again. My life has changed. Will you take me as your disciple? You look happy these days, said Master Taiyan. Is there anything else? No, replied he. Thanks to your help, all is well. Then why not apply it? Asked Master Taiyan. So this is a story that personally I've been very fond of for many, many years, and I've told it many times in many different sort of scenarios. And just before we sort of go and look at the story in a bit more detail, this talk did have a title, because Bob always asks me for a title, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but it has to do with 2 concepts that exist in Japanese Buddhism that are called jiriki and tariki. And jiriki refers to what's known as self-power, and tariki refers to other power. And really this relates to walking the Buddha's way towards nirvana or towards enlightenment. It asks the question, can we do this by our own power alone, or do we require an external power to help us? And the reason that this has become, or did become, a subject of interest in Japanese Buddhism is that really the 2 schools that were seen to epitomize these sort of 2 different approaches, the Zen school was seen to, my own school was seen to represent self-power, jiriki, and the Pure Land school, which arose in China at around about the same time that Zen did, known as Chan in China. The Pure Land school represents other power. And for those who aren't familiar with what the Pure Land school actually is, it's known as, it has as its central practice the chanting of what's called the Nembutsu. And the Nembutsu, quite simply, is Namu Amida Buddha. And this school arose, as I say, in China and became the most popular Buddhist school in the whole of Mahayana, in the whole of the Japanese Mahayana milieu, or in Chinese and Japanese. And that's because it was known as a lay school. And even now, today in Japan, by far, the Pure Land school is the largest Buddhist school. It has the most temples and the most adherents as well. And the reason for this is that, according to the founding story of the Pure Land school, Amida Buddha, in a previous incarnation, was a king, and he sold everything, he converted to Buddhism, he sold everything, gave it all away, and undertook great personal efforts to become enlightened, but not for his own sake. As we know in Mahayana, this is the Bodhisattva path, and the Bodhisattva path relies on the Bodhisattva vows, and the principal Bodhisattva vow is to be of service to all sentient beings. Just as Bob chanted, he dedicated the merit to attain enlightenment for himself and for ourselves, but this is to be contingent on being of benefit for all beings. That is the principal bodhisattva vow. And this king did the same, and he accrued what was called a huge amount of merit through his spiritual practices, and from this spiritual merit, he created what was called a Pure Land. I won't go into the whole technical thing because it's not really relevant for the talk tonight. And this Pure Land was known as the Western Paradise. And the idea was that whoever was born into the Western Paradise, which Amida Buddha created through his own merit and lies within what's called his Buddha field, will be guaranteed enlightenment in a single lifetime. So you can see why lay people would be very keen on that. And in fact, not only that, but he also made a vow, a promise, that anybody who chanted his name more than 18 times in their entire life would be guaranteed rebirth in this Buddha realm, that all we have to do is to ask for it. And the reason for this is that the Pure Land basis for enlightenment is that we humans are so mired in delusion, so held back by our own karma, that we simply cannot help ourselves. And therefore we require literally the equivalent of, in Christianity, what's known as grace. If you know, in Christianity, we cannot save ourselves either. We can only be rescued by the grace of God. And otherwise no one would make it to heaven. And in fact, when Christianity came across the Pure Land, it recognized in the Pure Land the closest form of Buddhism to itself, precisely because it requires a savior, it requires a saving figure in order to allow humans to attain enlightenment, this figure being Amida Buddha, who is the Buddha of this Western paradise and who can be called upon and therefore to be rescued. And therefore, Tariki, other power, became really the sort of core understanding or foundation of the Pure Land school. Zen, on the other hand, well, you've sort of got these images of the sort of Zen monk or practitioner sitting facing the wall for 20 years or whatever, and then breaking through into enlightenment as a result. So we have this self-power and this other power. And the great sort of, or very popular Daisetsu Suzuki, D.T. Suzuki, wrote an article on this, where he actually said that this dichotomy was a false one. And that's a little bit what I'm going to look at tonight. It may sound a little bit like a dry subject, but bear with me, because actually it's an important distinction when it comes to it. But before we get on to that, I want to just sort of deal with the story itself, with the content of this story itself. Here, first of all, we have this Zen master. The two characters here are obviously Master Taiyan and this old gentleman. Now, Master Taiyan, I have tried to find information about him, and not only could I not find it on Wikipedia or Google, even ChatGPT has let me down. And in fact, I cannot find any reference to Master Taiyan whatsoever, so I have no idea. I suspect it's might be a made-up name. I'm not sure. I don't know why, but there we go. But it's a great story all the same. Doesn't really matter. And this story, obviously, I would suspect, probably happened. It feels a bit sort of 19th century. And the reason for that is that the old gentleman is a chamberlain. It describes him. It said he'd been a chamberlain at court, and this court, obviously, because it takes place in Japan. Very clearly, it takes place in Japan, because he was this chamberlain was part of the Japanese emperor's court, and the chamberlains were responsible for being in attendance with the emperor when he had meetings, diplomacy, anything like that, making and passing laws and all the rest of it. And really, that sort of happened sort of post the Meiji Restoration around 1868. So probably sometime in the latter part of the 19th century, maybe early 20th, I don't know. But this is what I think we're looking at. And so this old gentleman comes along. Now, we have this old gentleman who's suffered a loss. Well, in fact, he's suffered a number of losses. He's been retired, so he's no longer... got that status of being the emperor's chamberlain. The children are grown up and have left. It's a bit of empty nest syndrome. And also he's recently become a widower as well. So those are three big losses, for anybody really to face. And as a result of that, he's sort of fallen into this loneliness. And I mentioned this before, but one of the effects of loss, or one of the effects of bereavement of any kind, and I don't just mean bereavement as in losing a person that you love, but when you have a big change that happens in your life, which for some could be redundancy, could be illness, could be really anything, there's a sense of being cut off. And what you're cut off from are two things, really. Your life as it was previously, with the familiar habits, with the familiar surroundings, with everything that sort of we feel that we depend upon to enable us to feel happy, loved, satisfied, etc. And we cannot see the future without these things either. We feel cut off from the path that we thought that we were walking. And even the things that normally would make us happy, if we like watching films or listening to music or going for a walk or indulging ourselves in whatever our hobbies may be, they feel flat. When we're in a state of bereavement, we become really quite cocooned. We become separate, and this is a sort of exacerbated sense of self-consciousness. When we talk in Buddhism about the self, or me, myself, I, as you'll be aware, the Buddha described this feeling of an I, or as actually a delusion. He said it's an appearance only. It has no root in actuality and reality. And what he's talking about is two things. One is this feeling that there is a split between me and everything else. And the other thing is that this entity that I feel lives in here is permanent, or has some kind of semi-permanent status or existence. And the Buddha denied both of those. And generally what we're talking about in this case is how something appears. This feeling of myself is how I actually feel. It's how I present to myself. And when we're suffering, we have this divorcedness, this feeling of being really quite isolated. And it's the same, for example, I've talked about the proverbial, being invited to the proverbial sort of cocktail party where you don't know anybody except the host. And you go in, and if you're feeling a little bit sort of socially shy, you sort of stand in the corner, you see everybody else is in little huddled groups talking to each other and laughing, and you're standing on your own, and you don't know whether to sort of barge into a conversation, or whether, or if you stand there too long on your own, people might start looking at you and thinking you're a bit weird, for example. So they're also in that situation. We have a strong feeling of being separate, of being cut off, and separate from what is going on actually around us. And that is a feeling of I. That is a feeling of self-consciousness. And this loneliness, this sense of loneliness actually is something, obviously, that this old man feels as well. And as I say, the other thing is that even when we try to sort of give ourselves or indulge ourselves in our old, things that normally make us happy, we find that they don't. I remember Miyokyo saying that she knew a chap, I presume it was in the 1950s or whatever. He used to suffer from bouts of depression, and he was a Londoner by birth, and he, in one of these sort of bouts of depression, suddenly remembered that when he was a boy, his father used to take him to Battersea Park and would buy him an ice cream, and that was one occasion when he used to feel really happy, really thrilled. So he thought, that's what I'm going to do. So he went back to Battersea Park, found the ice cream vendor, bought an ice cream, stood there and ate this ice cream. Nothing. Nothing. Time had moved on. He was also, feeling depressed as well. It wasn't going to lift him out. He was too, that sense of disconnectedness with that little boy who felt real joy. in eating an ice cream that his dad had bought in Battersea Park couldn't be evoked by going through this sort of cosplay ritual, if you like. So this is what the old, this is how we need to understand the predicament of the old man. He's probably tried everything that he can to sort of get himself out of this, and nothing is working. So he's really stuck. And this is now when he goes to see Master Tyan. And Master Tyan, listens to his story and has some suggestions to make, perhaps ones that we would expect. So the first thing he thinks, well, normally in this sort of situation, I would get him to practice meditation. So how would meditation help him? Well, that's because in the practice of meditation, actually what we are learning to evoke in consciousness is this state of what's called samadhi, which translates as oneness. Samadhi is a Sanskrit term, which means being at one with. And this arises when the feeling, when this appearance, this feeling of myself becomes less. And eventually, and can actually drop off. And this is in fact how we know that the Buddha's teaching of no I is absolutely genuine. That the natural state of consciousness is an I-less state, is a state of samadhi. Because we enter into samadhi every single day. We just don't recognize it when it happens. But we can give some examples. So for example, if we're engaged in something that we really like, then that feeling of I actually vanishes. I had an uncle who was a great, he loved building models from scratch. He made model aircraft from sort of balsa wood and all this sort of stuff, not from kits. And he could spend hours doing that. He had a room where he made these models, and he could spend hours doing that. And when he went into that room, whatever problems he had on the outside, the bills, business, whatever it was, vanished. The self who would worry about those things would disappear, because when this was something that he really loved doing, and so he would naturally become at one with the activity. And the samadhi of model building would naturally arise with him. We also all experience it as well, if you like going to watch films, for example, or watching TV dramas or something. You go and see a James Bond film or something like that, and Bond is getting chased and he's jumping from building to building. Your own heart rate's going up because you're actually what's called in psychology, what used to be called in psychology, the participation mystique, which means that our consciousness loses its sense of identity as me, Martin, and becomes partly James Bond. We are experiencing what James Bond is feeling. This is the empathetic feeling that happens not just when we see other people suffering, but happens quite naturally in play. So children are very good at this. Children are very good at transforming themselves into Superman or Peppa Pig, or turning a cardboard tube from from kitchen foil into a rocket or a ray gun or a train or an elephant's trunk or anything. They naturally can transform themselves, but also objects as well, through this participation mystique, which is a form of samadhi. The problem is that, of course, that's fine if we're doing things that we like, but what happens when we're doing things that we don't particularly like? When we're having to do things that we don't particularly like, I am there quite strongly because I'm judging it, because I'm actually, saying, I don't really want to do this. Oh God, if I hurry up and get this done, then, it will be all right. But even in those situations, actually, if we can enter into a participation mystique or enter into the samadhi of the situation, then actually even things that I don't like can suddenly light up and become interesting. And I remember when I was studying for my what used to be called O levels, now are GCSEs, and I had to study history. I love history now, but I hated it when I was a kid, and particularly we were doing European history from 1870 to 1914. I just wasn't interested, and they had all these very complicated, the country's different sort of agreements and all this sort of stuff that led to the First World War. I couldn't remember it, and I wasn't interested. And so when it came to my O levels, I left history to the last minute. So it's a classic sign: procrastinating, not doing it. The other stuff, I like sciences, so I studied sciences. I was keen, I was interested. Maths, I wasn't very good at, but I was actually interested in maths, so I was happy to work quite hard at that, and I enjoyed that, even though I wasn't very good. But history, not only was I not very good, I didn't like it either. And so I would leave it. And then it would come to the point where, I couldn't leave it anymore. The exam was really coming very close, and I had to do something. So, I'd open the book, and then I'd think, Mum's right, I really should tidy the room. And so I, engaged in a little bit of those sort of distractions, and then realised, I've got to get back. So I started reading, and I'd read the first page, and I'd get to the end, and it was like my mind was blank, and I would think, I can't remember a single thing that I've read, so I'd have to read it again. And then I'd start feeling tired, So all those sort of little tricks that sort of come up that seek to sort of distract me and get me out of that. But actually, once I'd really started to buckle down to it and began reading it, there was it's sort of like there was an inertia, and then there's a sort of hump. But once you get over the inertia, then suddenly it began to become alive. And I began to become interested in it. I could suddenly begin to see the connections between the various things that were happening, and could see this sort of story emerging and where it was going. And I had a real sense that I thought, oh my God, this is really interesting. I wish I'd taken this seriously before. And it was the quality of vitality that was important there. What I didn't know at the time is that there was an entering into samadhi with this. In other words, that barrier that I and other presents, that appearance sense, had begun to atrophy, it had begun to sort of go away. But it required, a consistent effort, and I had to overcome. The most difficult thing I had to overcome was the internal judgment that I don't like history. There's the I, the don't like, and the history. Once that began to be forgotten, once that began to go, then the vitality began to appear as the samadhi emerged. So that's why Master Taiyan wanted the old gentleman to practice meditation, because if he could get him into that state, that sense of loneliness, which is produced by that sense of separation, would go. And the man could then re-enter life as it now was. But the problem here was that this man had already sat a lot of zazen. Not as zazen maybe as a monk would do, but he would have been up in the middle of the night with the emperor. So the emperor would start meeting people at 3 a.m. And they would sit all the way through. And they have to sit in seiza, so they would sit very formally. So they would kneel on their heels, and they would just have to sit very still, like that, as the emperor held meetings. They couldn't move. So he'd probably sat more zazen than most Zen roshis in Japan have ever sat. But the problem is that if he had given him formal zazen to do, he would probably just see this as an extension of something that he'd already done, and it wouldn't quite cut it. It wouldn't really work. So then he goes on to the next one, which is the contemplation of nature. So why the contemplation of nature? Because if you go out into nature yourself, you go for walks and so forth, go into nature, it's actually not difficult to open out and begin to feel a sense of connection with all the things that are going on around. And particularly if we go around and we're interested in maybe the birds are singing and we're looking at the plants and we're wondering what the trees are, actually we can begin to lose ourselves into that. And that losing ourselves into that is also that participation. It's also part of that arising of samadhi. And then when we get into that, we often have in nature aesthetic experiences. So we might see, particularly now, you see a tree in full bloom, for example, and you think, wow, and in that sort of wow moment, there's a moment of what's what we could call not seeing the tree, but being beholden to it. Actually being held by it, to behold a tree means to be captivated by it. There's a moment when we see something that's truly beautiful and it moves us. It comes in. It's quite a different experience to just look at something. So you can look at something and think, oh, that's a dandelion, or that's a nettle, or that's whatever it might be. That's still eye observing it. But when we see something truly, grand or truly beautiful, it moves us. It comes in, so we're beholden by it as well. And that also is a moment of samadhi as well. And it's interesting. I mean, in Japan now, the doctors prescribe walks in nature, what's called forest bathing, for women who are recovering from breast cancer. And they've had data to show that it speeds the healing process. But they have to go out. They have to go out on their own, and they have to walk on their own into a remote place in nature for a certain length of time. They have to do it every single day. But it seems to have measurable healing medicinal qualities for that. And that happens naturally. I mean, even research in the West has sort of shown that when people are in nature, for example, their stress levels, cortisol levels go down, and people do feel, less stressed and more of a sense of well-being, and it can promote well-being, generally, which is why this sort of thing is given. So Master Taiyan thought, well, this is another way. So that's why he suggested this contemplation of nature. The contemplation of nature certainly is something that's very popular in Chinese and Japanese Buddhism. So you can see there's a lot of art connected with it. You'll see that, in Chinese and Japanese brush painting, for example, you will have a mountain, or you might have the bamboo, or you might have some fruit or some birds, and there'll be a poem, written by the side of it as well. And you get these hanging scrolls, and you put them up on your wall, etc. And they're very lovely. And of course, it's part of the sort of culturedness as well. It's part of the sort of art there as well. And this old gentleman, coming from the imperial court, as he did, would have been immersed in this. So he would have known all the poetry. He would have known all the great painters. And the problem was that if you send him out into nature and he would see a full moon, for example, 3 poems would probably come up in his mind, And the problem is that he would be so busy, thinking and recollecting about these, that he wouldn't actually be able to just be beholden, just to be held by the vision of the beauty of the full moon, or of the cherry blossom, or of the mountain, or of the waterfall, or whatever it would be. And so it would be getting in the way. So therefore, Master Taiyan went on to a more immediate method. And that was this. It told him to go into his innermost chamber and there to perform these 9 prostrations. Okay, so it could be 9 prostrations, it could be 9 bows. Doesn't really matter actually in practice. And what's interesting about this is that I've actually done this as a practice, and I've also recommended it as a practice to other people, and it works. It works incredibly, literally, as he's described it here. Don't think of it as symbolic or anything like that. As a practice, it works. It is very, very good for containing powerful emotional uprushes and impulses as well. And I remember at the Buddhist Society in London, for many years I ran a course called First Footsteps in Buddhist Practice. And this was a course for people who are new to Buddhism. They'd come, they'd done the sort of study, the Buddhist study thing, where they could do the Four Noble Truths and all that sort of thing. That's a sort of 7-week course. But they weren't quite ready to go on to one of the practice classes like the Theravada or Zen. But the president said to me, well, I'd like you to write a course, a practical course for people, a short course for people, just to get a taste of what Buddhist practice is like. Not with the sitting meditation, because there were already classes that would teach you that, but the actual daily life practice, what's sometimes called mindfulness practice. So I said, yeah, that's absolutely fine. So I based it on a Pali scripture called the Satipatthana, which is translated as the 4 foundations of mindfulness, Four Foundations of Awareness, I prefer. And this is, again, you can sort of look it up, but it's a very short sutta, but it's the Buddha gives the instructions for how this Buddhist practice should go. And so it was a 6-week course, and on one of the courses we deal with mindfulness of emotional states of consciousness. It's the biggest subject, it's the most important subject, because any form of transformation has to include the emotional life. The Buddhist practice proper is not an intellectual exercise. There's a certain amount of intellect that's required, but the actual transforming agent is the emotions themselves: greed, hatred, and delusion. Those are the three that must be transformed in the end. So it requires, obviously, an awareness of the passions, of the emotions, what are called in Tibetan the 3 poisons, when they actually arise. The Sanskrit is the kleshas, which just simply means the obstacles. And so we talked about this, and I said, look, one of the practices in Buddhism is some kind of practice of restraint. I said the reason for that is that whenever we restrain a desire, we become conscious of it. Most of the time, if a desire comes up in us, if we're able to satisfy it quite quickly, we don't really notice it's there. And it's not until a desire is thwarted in some way that we can experience it actually in our own bodies, in our own beings, because it cannot satisfy itself. Because what is a desire? Well, a desire is an emotion, and emotion shares the same root as the verb to motivate, because that's what emotions do. They move us to action. We either want to get hold of something, or we want to get out of something, want to get rid of something. Those are if you like, the 2 most basic things. You can call it lust or love, you can call it hate, you can call it anger or anxiety or whatever, or grief or vanity or jealousy or any of these things. But actually, they sort of come down to one of 2 things. Either we want to acquire something, or we want to get rid of something. In that way, it's like 2 movements, and that's what the emotion seeks us to do, to move us. So if a desire, and a desire can also can be wanting or it can be hating as well, they're both desires. If a desire is thwarted in some way, then we have to bear it. We actually have to physically bear it in consciousness, and it becomes painful. And that pain, again, is trying to motivate us, it's trying to move us into action. But if we hold it, if we actually hold that pain, that suffering, then it begins to transform, because everything is subject to change, and it cannot last forever. There was a, I won't go into it. It's just it cannot last forever, and sooner or later it will begin to subside. And having witnessed the subsiding of a passion in that way, we recognize its impermanence, we recognize its temporality, and it no longer overwhelms us. We know that we can do it. And again, it was I remember the late Trevor Leggett, who was a judo pioneer, brought judo to this country, and he was once asked by someone who wanted to give up smoking, and Trevor Leggett's advice was, well, don't try and give up. He said, as soon as you set your mind to giving it up, you're basically provoking a desire to smoke, because you'll now set yourself against your own desire and make an enemy of it, and then you're at war with it, basically. And it will overcome you, because this is an old habit, and it will most likely overcome you. So he said, what you have to understand is, what you have to work with is the nature of this desire. And he said, the thing about desire, he said, is that, and this is different to aspiration, is that desires are like straw fires. They burn very hot, very brightly. If you set straw on fire, it burns very hot, very brightly, but for a very short period of time. So he said, what I advise to you is that when the desire to smoke, to have a cigarette arises in you, stop, take your watch, and wait for 2 minutes. Then at the end of that 2 minutes, ask yourself again, do I want a cigarette? If you do, have a cigarette. If you don't, then just carry on. And that worked. That worked for him, because what he discovered is that the impulse to want a cigarette, and being an ex-smoker myself, I do understand this actually, the impulse to smoke is often tied to very specific things, so like the end of a meal, or as a sort of reward system, or when I finish this work, I have to clean up the cat litter, and after that, then I can have a cigarette, so I'll get on. And so I use it as a sort of carrot and stick type thing, that I can reward myself. Or I can use it to sort of produce a sort of sense of confidence, so that I'll have a cigarette and that'll prepare me for this difficult meeting that I'm going to that I need to have now. So we can use it in this way, but actually, if you stop and wait for a short period of time, it doesn't hold up. These desires do move quite quickly. They come in and they go. What usually happens is that we don't wait. We seek to satisfy the desire very quickly. Hence, the importance of the practice of restraint in order to become aware, in order to develop mindfulness of emotional states. Anyway, so I'd explained all this to them. And sure enough, I said, well, you can use this. And I said, what I'd like you to do is just to become aware of a particular something, when something comes up, of a strong feeling coming up, is to then go and just do 9 bows. I said, if you're at work and you're finding yourself, maybe impatient or just a little bit at the end, or you're feeling that, somebody's got at you or something like that, then just go to the loo, lock yourself in the cubicle, and then just bow 9 times. So don't even ask, who am I bowing to? Exactly the instructions. So don't ask what it's for. Don't think, why am I bowing to the toilet? You're not bowing to the toilet. You're just bowing. You're not bowing to anything. You are just bowing, and that is all. Do it 9 times, and then at the end of that ninth one, just take a sort of internal check. See how you are. What's the temperature inside now? If you're still raging, do 9 more, and then ask yourself the same question. So the following week, we always had this sort of feedback session where I'd say, well, how did it go? And there was a young woman there, and she said, I got to, because we used to have this on a Thursday night, the class on a Thursday night. She said, the day after, on the Friday, she said, I had a really bad day at work. She said, I did something wrong at work, and I cocked up, basically. And I knew I was going to get into some trouble for it. But my boss wouldn't be able to see me until the Monday. And as I went home that evening, I thought to myself, this is going to prey on my mind over the whole weekend. It's going to completely ruin my weekend. And she said, I got home, and she said, oh, God. She said, I really wasn't looking forward to the weekend because of this. And she said, I suddenly remembered the advice that you'd given. So I went into my room, closed the door, and I did 9 prostrations, actually. And then I got up and I sort of carried on. And she said, it wasn't until Sunday evening that I suddenly remembered this incident that had happened on the Friday. She said, I hadn't thought about it once since then. She said, I'm absolutely stunned at it. The other one that was even funnier was that there was a sort of older middle-aged woman there, and she said, well, my problem is, she said, that is my neighbour's central heating. She said, it comes on at 1 o'clock in the morning, and we share a semi-detached house, and I can hear her central heating come on in the pipes in the wall, and it wakes me up. She said, my husband stays asleep. He sleeps through the whole thing, but it wakes me up, and I get furious. I say, why is her central heating coming on at 1 o'clock in the morning? What a ridiculous thing to actually do. Why does she do it? And she says, I lie there and I see. And she had told me this the week before, so I said, well, okay. I said, well, you could get out and just do these, prostrations. She said, no, it'll disturb my husband. So I said, okay. I said, you can do something that's similar. I said, just lie in bed and just go, yes, yes. She said, I will not say yes to that woman's central heating. I said, no, you're not saying yes to the central heating. You're saying yes to the reaction that's coming up in you about her central heating. Forget the central heating. It's the reaction we're interested in. Not interested in the circumstances, just the reaction. So she sort of looked at me and I thought, well, we'll see if she does it. Anyway, so the following week she came back and And she said that, that night she had woken up, sure enough, as the central heating came on at 1 o'clock in the morning. And she began sort of, ruminating over this and complaining. And then she remembered what I'd said. So she lay there and said, yes. She said, oh, this is ridiculous. Yes. Oh, this won't work. Yes. So the next thing, her alarm was going off at 7 o'clock in the morning. And everybody went, oh, wow, that's amazing. She sat there with a face like thunder. And I said, what is it? And she said, that woman shouldn't have a central heating coming on. Couldn't quite let it go, even though it worked. So this is definitely a thing. And this is why I think this story is particularly important. But what I'm interested in, what I sort of want to, I'm aware of the time, what I want to sort of lead on to is something that's not overt in this story, but actually runs through it. Because bowing or prostrating are devotional acts. They're acts of devotion that normally, we bow to the Buddha, for example. People will, prostrate to the Buddha or to the Guru or to the Bodhisattvas, or there's this sense that, here are these beings outside of ourselves and we bow to them because they're more powerful than us, they're wiser than us, they have more merit than us, and therefore we are asking for help. We're asking for, and that is an other power. That is an other power. And yet here in this story, we sort of have something that is that seems to be the same. Master Taiyan, he, as I said, when he recognized that the meditation wasn't going to work and the going into nature, two things that he could do himself, but the laying down of himself and the, as it were, the offering of himself, the invitation, that's going towards that other power practice. And so perhaps we can begin to see that there seems to be a sort of coming together here. And I'd like to just sort of tell another story about another Zen master called Master Gute. So Master Gute, because the same thing happens for him. Master Gute took a vow to become awakened for the benefit of all sentient beings, the classic Bodhisattva vow. But he went further than that. He had a devotional practice. So he went into the forest and he built a shrine to the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, or in the Chinese version it's Kuan Yin, Canon in Japan. Avalokiteshvara is the Bodhisattva of compassion. Kuan Yin is actually a Chinese moon goddess, but she's also the goddess of mercy, and therefore she sort of mixed with the Bodhisattva of compassion for obvious reasons. So you often see these sort of pictures of, or these statues of Kuan Yin, Chinese ones. She's sort of looks like a Chinese lady with a very long robe, and she holds a sort of lotus or a rose sometimes as well. And this is the Bodhisattva. This is the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, a little bit like Tara is to them. And so he developed this practice of, the shrine, making offerings, bowing, and so forth, and also reciting the 25th chapter of the Lotus Sutra, which is known as the Avalokiteshvara Sutra. It's actually the 25th chapter of the Lotus Sutra is actually a standalone sutra. It exists in its own right, and it is devoted to the power of this particular Bodhisattva. So he would recite this as a devotional practice, and he did this for 10 years, and nothing happened. And then one day, a Buddhist nun was passing and came up to him and said, "Can you say a word of Zen?" And Gute couldn't. And so this threw him into a real dilemma, because he suddenly realized that this 10 years of quite intense devotional practice seemed to have done nothing, absolutely, seems to have just wasted his time. And it threw him into a real perplexity and into a real problem. And he became quite depressed about this, but also thinking, well, what can I do about this? And so he had to sit with that for a while. And then a short time after, his master-to-be, a man called Master Tenryu, came along. And so when Gute had an audience with him, he asked him the same question. He said, "Can you say a word of Zen?" And in that classic sort of Zen way, Tenryu raised a finger, like this. And at that moment, Goethe had his awakening and became enlightened at that moment. Goethe was famous for this finger. And when people came to him and would say, can you say a word of Zen, or what is the essence of Buddhism, Goethe would raise this finger, you see. And it's said that he brought many people to awakening through the use of this finger. So it sort of became his, what would you call it, sort of...
signature.
So yes, thank you very much. His Zen signature, if you like. That's what everybody knew about Goethe's finger, and it became very famous. And there's actually so much so that when he set up his own monastery, one of the temple boys used to go around, and he would also, because he'd seen Goethe doing this, so he would go around trying to bring other people to awaken by showing them this finger, you see. And Goethe got to hear about this, and he called the boy, and he said to the boy, can you say a word of Zen? And the boy raised his finger like this, and Goethe grabbed the finger, pulled out a knife, and cut the finger off the boy. And the boy screamed, turned, and ran to the door. And Goethe said, can you now say a word of Zen? And the boy turned round and raised the sort of stump of his finger like that. And in that moment, the boy became enlightened too. That's the story. I remember I was in the library at the Buddhist Society, and I was looking through some back issues of the Middle Way, which is the Buddhist Society's journal. And I came across a 2-page article on this story by Myokyoni, my teacher. And very typical Myokyoni, if you thought, normally when people tell that story, they'll say, well, he was a Zen master and we shouldn't take it literally. They'll sort of tiptoe around the whole thing. She absolutely doubled down on this. And she said, I know you're all thinking this is a terrible story, the brutalizing of a young boy. But would you be ready if Goethe came with his knife to cut off your finger? Would you be ready? So typical Myokyoni. That's absolutely not going back at all. Anyway, so that was Goethe's story. But I tell that story because if you hear his own enlightened experience, this 10 years, and then the nun giving him the problem, and then Tenryu coming and raising the finger and then becoming enlightened, it's easy to think that somehow those 10 years were a waste. But that's not actually how we should look at that story at all. Because we have exactly the same when the Buddha was awakened as well. Because if you think about it, the Buddha had all that life before, the life in the palace, the 4 trips out of the palace where he sees the impermanence of the world, old age, sickness and death. He then renounces the life in the palace, he takes up the robe, he goes to the 2 teachers, he leaves them, he then goes into the forest with the 5 ascetics, with those really austere practices where he really starves himself to death. He then rejects that life and the 5 ascetics abandon him. And then he sits under the Bodhi tree, remember? And he sits there for a week. And what happens on the morning of the 8th day is that it's saying as he was coming out of meditation, coming out of deep absorption, he looks up and sees the morning star. Yeah? And on the seeing of the morning star, he awakens. And that motif runs all the way through, certainly in the Zen school and in other schools as well, that the enlightenment doesn't happen when they're in meditation. It happens when they have some kind of, something happens. There's a sound, like Daito Kokuji became awakened when he heard a key fall onto a table. Rayun smelled the peach blossoms and awakened. Kyogen heard a pebble click against the bamboo and was awakened. And with the Buddha, it was on the morning of the 8th day. The question is, if it had been cloudy that morning, would the Buddha have become enlightened?
Yes.
We don't know, because it was the morning. We can only speculate. We can only speculate. But that's the interesting thing, that it doesn't seem to. In one sense, something had to come in from the outside, but the Buddha to be had to be ready. That question, "Are you ready?" is the important one. It's hence the case with Goethe's finger, and that is why those 10 years are important. Without those 10 years, and then the nun coming along, throwing him into that problem, and then Tenryu coming along and releasing him from that as well. All those things run together. They're all part of one story. We shouldn't see them as three separate things. We could even say, perhaps, that the nun was Avalokiteshvara, because she produced in him the crisis, the spiritual crisis that Tenryu then had to come along and help him out of. So if we can see that, perhaps we can begin to understand that actually our training isn't just dependent on our own efforts, isn't just dependent on the circumstances outside. It's actually the two things have to work together. This is what's known as the coming together of dharma, which is the circumstances, and karma, which are the internal circumstances. Again, Myogeni said that she had somebody staying with her at Shobuan, which is the temple, and she told the story of Master Kyogen, who came to his awakening hearing the pebble against the bamboo. It's a long story, I won't necessarily go. I'll tell it another time. Anyway, suffice to say, it's a very impressive story. It took 20 years, but finally he hears this pebble click against the bamboo and he has his own profound awakening. And she then had to go out to the Buddhist Society and came back. And this young chap was in the garden. They have a bamboo thicket. And he was throwing pebbles at the bamboo thicket. And she had to break the news. She said, it's not necessarily going to work for you in that way. You have to have gone through, gone through what Kyogen went through. In other words, you had to be ready. You had to be ready for that. Otherwise, it doesn't matter what you can go and look at the morning star. You can smell the peach blossoms. You can hear the sound of the brook. You can do all those things. But if the inner state isn't there, then it won't. Then those two things won't gel. Those two things won't come together. But why is that so important? Why is then this Jiriki and Tariki so important? That they're both sort of talked of in this way? Because the fundamental reality from the Buddha's teachings is that this sense of separateness, that I am here and you are all out there, and that this is the same for each of us, is truly a false one. That actually consciousness itself is not discrete packets or discrete entities. It's one thing. That the state of samadhi is the foundational reality. And the appearance of I is the delusion or the cloud that obscures that reality. And that because this reality is one thing, the outside and the inside are not two separate things. As it says in one of the sutras, there are not two dharmas. There's only one. Actually, there's just the one thing. Which is why self-power and other power is an appearance only. In the end, those two things do actually come back to that one thing. So, how to sort of end this? Because I don't, because I'd like to leave some time for perhaps just a little bit of quiet sitting before we have some sort of questions and answers, if anybody has any. The heart of our practice is not to accumulate or to acquire for ourselves, but actually it's to lay something down, to empty out. And when we do truly empty the heart out, what arises, or what we discover there, is a quality of consciousness that is both has a sense of quietness or stillness about it, but also a sort of roominess or a spaciousness within it. And this is the quality of reflective consciousness. This is what's known as the heart mirror, that quality of consciousness. And when I say quietness, I don't necessarily mean an absence of noise. It's an absence of reactivity to things. It's an ability to be able to stay with and to, as it were, be the space in the room where objects can come in and leave, but without actually disturbing the space. Just like the space in this room, you can fill it full of stuff, you can empty it all out. It doesn't affect the space within the room at all. The space is always there. The length, the height, the length and the width remain exactly the same, whether the room is full or whether it's empty. That is undisturbed. This is the quality of consciousness as well that we experience in sitting meditation, in those deeper states. But this state is not something that is produced, it's something that is uncovered. It's something that is revealed when the heart is allowed to become quiet. And out of that quiet spaciousness, that's where the wisdom, the prajna paramita, arises. And this prajna paramita is who actually in Buddhist iconography is pictured as a goddess. She's known as the mother of all the Buddhas, because the Buddha is the activity, it's the activity of wisdom, the preaching, the teaching, and the deliverance of beings from suffering. But the prajna paramita is the quiet stillness out of which the wisdom itself arises. And this is where our practice is trying to take us into. We practice on the seat, on the meditation seat, and we develop that quietness and we become familiar with it. But the task then is when we get up to maintain it. And if we do lose it, to return to it as quickly as we possibly can. The more that we re-experience that and re-experience that and re-experience that, the easier it can become to in the middle of the hubbub, in the middle of the whirl. There's a very nice koan that goes along the lines of clouds swirling around the mountain peak. Do not disturb the stillness. So if you imagine the mountain, that great, immovable mountain, and that there are these ephemeral clouds that swirl around the peak of it, but they don't disturb the stillness of the mountain. And so in this way, even in meditation, it's not necessarily to blank the mind. In fact, we shouldn't do that. Master Rinzai says, do not stop the heart. In other words, do not stop the heart producing what its feelings, its memories, and all this sort of thing. They just arise and pass away. But if we stay with the stillness, these things don't have to touch the sides. They can come and they can go. They can come and they can go. And they will begin to quieten quite naturally. And they won't ever completely stop until we're dead and in the coffin. We don't need to have them stop. We just need not to be either to reject them or to be carried away by them. That is the middle way. That is the very first teaching that the Buddha gave, teaching the middle way. Normally we think of the middle way as being the middle way between the extremes of indulgence in worldly desire and extreme ascetic privation. And that's certainly one example of it. But in the practice of meditation and mindfulness, daily life practice, there is a middle way as well. And this is precisely what it is. So I think I want to leave it there for now, because obviously I'm aware of the time. We did start a little bit late. So I think what we could do is just have maybe 5 minutes or so just quiet sitting, and then if anybody has any questions, we can have those.
Recording in progress.
So we have an opportunity for any questions if people have any. If you're online and want to, you can just unmute and just speak.
Surely I could ask you about Pure Land Buddhism.
Yes.
We have to do this practice of chain residence for some really good die or some really never die, or do it generally. And it's called the power transfer of consciousness to the deceased, to the Pure Land. So we're sort of doing that on behalf of the deceased person or people. So is that asking for the grace of chain resin?
Yes.
To help this person? And if we're motivated by love, is that sort of part of the bodhisattva path?
Yes, it is. For a couple of reasons. So the Western paradise of Amida Buddha is one of a number of pure lands. So, in fact, if you have a look there's a teaching known as the wisdom Buddhas, when there are, or Dhyana Buddhas. There are 5 of them, and 4 of them exist around the cardinal point. So Amida Buddha is the Buddha of the West. There's Ascabaya, who's the Buddha of the East, and there's 2 others whose names I can't remember off the top of my head. And then there's the Sun Buddha, who sits in the middle. So these are sort of directional as well. But obviously they're taken to be symbolic as well. But anyway, so they have these pure lands, or these what are known as the Buddha fields, they're sometimes translated as. And as I said, in the case of Amida Buddha, they're made up of merit. So every time you chant, the name or the mantra or the Dharani of Chenrezig, then you are adding merit to that pure land, where that being, where the person that you're chanting for is. So you're actually, in Buddhism, it's quite interesting because whereas normally you would pray for another person, so like, but actually you pray for all beings for that person, because to pray for all beings for that person transfers that merit to that person as well. And it's just because there is no separateness in a Buddhist universe. You cannot just pray for one thing. You have to pray for everything. But by praying for everything, you help the one thing as well. Because if everything is okay, then that one thing is okay. Because there's the one in everything and everything in the one. That's how it works. That's the nature of reality in Buddhist metaphysics, if you like. So, yes, I mean, we can see it as a sort of, yes, I'm helping that person along. We're actually helping all beings, but it also helps that person along as well, and ourselves as well, because we're part of it too. So, yes, and it's a devotional practice, obviously, and that's how it will be seen to work.
I've got a few. I had a question. What do you actually mean by merit? Is it like sort of dissolving karma or scoring spiritual points? What does that actually mean in principle?
There are a number of ways that it's seen. I mean, I can only sort of describe how the word is used. So it does sometimes sound a little bit like there's a spiritual bank account and you can put merit into it. So
merit.
Yes, exactly, and that you can transfer this merit to others. In fact, that's what we're supposed to do, like Father did, at the beginning when he said, "We do this for the benefit of all beings." So that's the transfer of merit. So the way, merit is a product of karma. So karmic actions can, in Buddhism, are sort of divided into wholesome and unwholesome. Let's put it like that, because we don't tend to have good and evil in quite the same way as Christians do. So that's wholesome and unwholesome. Wholesome actions produce merit, which is a form of karma that produces adventitious incarnations in the future. That adventitious incarnation could be you tomorrow, how you will be tomorrow. It doesn't necessarily have to wait for another life, but it can also involve, future lives as well. And the thing is that if you practice unwholesome actions, then that increases suffering. So, hence we have, lists of skillful and unskillful actions. So, if we practice, if we're practicing, for example, here, if we sit meditation and chant, and even giving this talk, which is the giving of dana, these are all meritorious acts. So, at the end of this session, there will be a dedication of merit for the benefit of all beings. So we offer that out for the benefit of all beings. So that's how it's seen to work. It's not actually a substance, so it's not an actual substance, but you can talk about it in terms of, acquiring merit or not, as the case may be. But we have to be careful, because otherwise, for example, it's a little bit like saying to a Christian, why do you practice the good? if the Christian responds because I want to go to heaven, there's a selfish taint in that. And so Christians understand that, you know. So they practice the good because Jesus told them to. So that's why they do it. In Buddhism, we have something similar. So if we practice merit because I want to have a better rebirth, you know, in the future, that would be seen to actually destroy merit because I'm keeping it selfishly for myself. Yeah. Selfish actions are unwholesome. So in the offering of merit, in offering it to all beings, we acquire merit at the same time. So I remember Geshe Geltsen, who was one of the examiners for the Dalai Lama, he was giving a talk and he was saying, you know, a Buddha has to acquire huge mountains of merit in order to become the Buddha, you know. And someone piped up at the back saying, well, if you're always giving merit away, how does the Buddha acquire huge mountains of merit? And Geshe Geltsen replied and he said, yes. He said, by giving it away, he acquires huge mountains of merit. so it's not a substance, you know, it's not a substance. It's actually the cultivation of a selfless attitude, or it's the if you like, it's the cultivation of selfless consciousness. I can give another one of my favorite examples, which I told before anyway, here, but I rather like it, was an interview that the Dalai Lama gave to a British journalist who decided to ask the difficult questions. You know, why was Tibet invaded by the Chinese? Is that karma? And the Dalai Lama said, yes, it was. It's because we were a feudal country, and long after we should have abandoned it, and that was why. And he said, well, what about people who are disabled? Is that because of karma as well? And the Dalai Lama said, yes, it is. And one of his aides rushed over, seeing the potential PR car crash, fast approaching, and sort of spoke something in his ear, and the Dalai Lama sort of smiled and nodded and said, but it's only true for Buddhists. What? And he didn't, you know, the reporter, you know, obviously reported this, but there was no further explanation given. So I thought about that myself, and I think this is my speculation, but this is following on actually something that Ajahn Chah said, who was a forest dweller, Thai forest dwelling monk. And he said something can be true, but it also needs to be true in the Dharma. And what he meant by that is about how we understand some of these teachings. So in the case of karma and merit and so forth, and our understanding of karma, if we think that, you know, here you are suffering, and here am I not suffering, and I think, well, it's your own fault, you obviously did something terrible in the previous life, you know, it's your own fault, mate. That's your karma. That may be true according to strict understanding of karmic doctrines, but it would not be true in the Dharma because it lacks compassion. So these teachings shouldn't understand them in a sort of ontological sense of this is what is true. It has to be true within the framework of compassion and wisdom as well. So it has to be done skillfully. So what the Dalai Lama, I think, was actually saying was, look, when you see somebody who's suffering and you're not suffering, you have to think to yourself, in all the lifetimes that person and I have experienced, I have been in his position and he has been in mine. And in many, many lifetimes to come, he will again be in my position and I will be in his position. So therefore, how would I want him to behave towards me when I'm in that position? In other words, what's called the golden mean, which is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Classic. So that's basically what I think the Dalai Lama was pointing at. So we understand the workings, the teachings of karma and merit in those terms, if you see. Yeah.
Is there anyone online?
Anyone online? No, I think they all look pretty satisfied.
I have a follow-up question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
It's about I suppose, how relevant the preliminary practices are. So I just meditate normally these days, but I used to do the refuge prayer. I think the Sangha prayer? Various prayers with my Buddha book, and I imagine the Buddha field. Before I know it, I'm like 20 minutes in, and I haven't even meditated as I thought meditation was. And I get the idea is to build motivation to practice, to undull the mind, brighten the mind so you can practice meditation. But people who don't really practice Buddhist meditation, how necessary would it be for Buddhists to do it, and even non-Buddhists to do any sort of preliminary preliminary practice, five meditating.
Okay, I'm a real advocate for any form of devotional practice. I think we have a tendency in the West to make fairly swift judgments about spiritual practices. So people, I saw this happen in the 70s with yoga. So yoga is part of a much wider spiritual discipline that comes from Hinduism. And what we did was we sort of cut it out, lifted it out of the Hindu temple, and placed it in the nearest community centre. And there we started going to yoga classes, and we did it for exercise and for this, that, and the other. It's got nothing. It's not that it's got nothing to do with it, but it's not actually the most important thing about it. The most important thing is its context that we had taken it away from. We've done exactly the same with meditation. So meditation, has always been part of a wider spiritual framework which was interconnected and self-supporting. The different parts supported each other. And it's interesting because I know people who were very much part of the secular mindfulness movement, where they took the meditation and mindfulness practices out of principally Buddhism, de-religionized them, and then repackaged them as a well-being thing. That you can go to the NHS and you can get lessons on how to practice mindfulness to help you recover from addiction and depression and all these sorts of things as well. And that's fine, that was fine. But what they found was that they could only get so far, and then they ran into a wall. So now they went back and they've developed what's called compassion theory. They've realised that they needed compassion, and then they suddenly realised they needed an ethical framework within which all this happens. And suddenly you find this is beginning to look a lot like Buddhism again. Despite yeah, exactly. The one bit that we haven't taken on board that I think is really important for us and is probably going to cause the most resistance are the devotional practices. Because people who have had bad experiences with religion or just don't like it, devotional practices are the most religious looking things that you can do. But for the reasons that I've been talking about tonight, they are really important. Why? Because otherwise the motivation remains the wrong one. If we do not have a sense of something beyond ourselves that is higher than us, that we can bow down before, then we are still left with the self. It's always been the problem of Western psychology, is that the Western psychology deals with the self. It doesn't go beyond that. Religions go beyond the self, which is why they go beyond psychology. And Buddhist psychology is not the same as Western psychology. Buddhist psychology recognizes consciousness outside of individuals, that everything arises in consciousness. That's the foundational reality of all things. Hence why I said samadhi is seen as foundational to reality. And so those devotional practices, you can practice meditation without them. You can practice meditation without ethics. You can practice meditation without compassion. But you can't practice it as well as with them. And what is more as well, meditation is not about producing a state of consciousness. It's about, or just about that. It does produce this state of consciousness, but in that state of consciousness, the samadhi of things is revealed, and everything exists in that samadhi as one thing. So it's not about you or me. It's about the one thing of which we have always been a part. But because we don't recognize it, we suffer from fear and anxiety. So devotional practices are the key to overcoming anxiety. And people who suffer from anxiety, I have found devotional practices are some of the most powerful practices to help people overcome fear. And because anxiety is produced by acute self-consciousness. Remember the cocktail party example I gave? The feeling of being separate, and therefore either you see yourself as small and overwhelmed, or big and narcissistic and selfish. So the self and other sort of oscillate between those two things, and it's like you can go from one extreme to another. So people who are narcissistic, for example, are very easily upset and can be very easily made to feel small, and then they retaliate because they cannot, because it's the most fearful thing, for them. They feel overwhelmed by the other, and so they have to retaliate against it, and that allows them then to sort of feel dominant again. So whilst you're caught in that dichotomy, whilst you're caught in that pair of opposites, we would say, then you're always going to swing from one extreme to another. Both of those things have to go down, have to disappear, and that happens in samadhi, and that happens through devotional acts of some sort or the other. So I would say devotional acts are important, and those practices that you were doing are important, and they should be, but they sort of need to be felt in that way.
You need to understand the context of why you're doing it.
Yes. And then within that, when you practice meditation, it will prime the heart and the mind, and hopefully you'll sit deeper. Yeah. Okay.
Martin.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
So someone who doesn't have religious belief, but can feel gratitude. Would you say gratitude would be a good system?
Yes. You see, it's interesting. I mean, so the definition of religious belief, you see, people often looked at Zen in this way because, we appear to have no named deity or anything like that. And this is true in Buddhism. This is why Buddhism is often called a non-theistic religion, but it's not the same as atheistic. So atheistic, particularly to us, it tends to sort of come with a baggage about materialism and so on and so forth as well. And that's not what Buddhism is. Buddhism does have a spiritual power. It's called the Dharma. But it's not a deity as such. But the important thing about it is that anything that's bigger than I can work in this way. That's why compassion is seen as a motivating factor, because compassion for all beings, we are also that puts us into a relationship with all beings, because we are beings too, obviously. So when we offer merit for the benefit of all beings, we are also benefiting from it as well. That's how compassion works. It works because we are suffering with, and we are also benefiting with, all beings. We see ourselves as part of that all beings, which is bigger than just I. And that already has a flavour of something greater than I. Now, if you're in a theistic religion, God represents that. God is that. God is what is greater than I. I mean, in Buddhism, obviously, we have the Buddha. So, we venerate the Buddha. So we say we take refuge in the Buddha, his teachings, and in the Sangha. So the three refuges, for example. And if you go to Buddhist countries, you will see, people will pray to the Buddha. They will pray to bodhisattvas in the same way that Christians pray to saints to pass driving tests and things like that. People do exactly that. People do exactly that as well. It's certainly seen as part of the milieu, if you like, part of the sort of. It's what Buddhists do in Buddhist countries, and people have always sort of done those sorts of things. So, yeah, in Zen, obviously, we don't necessarily say, well, this is Amida Buddha and this is who we venerate by chanting his name, for example. We don't have that, but we do recognise that nature itself, if you like, the Buddha nature, what we call the Buddha nature, or the empty heart, this is seen as fitting into that otherwise God-shaped space. I don't know if that makes sense, but to answer your question, absolutely, gratitude. If you look at what gratitude is, it's recognizing something beyond yourself. Because otherwise, what are you feeling? You could only feel grateful to yourself. But you don't. You feel gratitude because of the circumstances. You feel gratitude because of your ancestors. You feel gratitude because of, the people around you who have supported you and held you up, and so forth. So these are all things that are other than you. And you're part of a network of relationships. So gratitude is an expression of a reality that's bigger than just you.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I think compassion are very, in some ways, very.
Yes, and again, as I say, it's a felt thing. Gratitude is something you feel, but it's based on an understanding of reality that is bigger than you. Did you? You're happy?
I've got some research to do, but
okay.
I've got a few. I think it's words. Words lose meaning. You said contain emotions, control emotions.
Contain.
And from my experience, it's about allowing and releasing. It's like looking and seeing them as inputs and releasing out the sensations and the energy. So they're a separate thing. But containing is very similar to rejecting and pushing down and then locking in and not releasing, which you can do.
It's the opposite.
That's what I mean.
It's the opposite of that. So let me
listen to you later on, and you actually said it a different way.
Okay.
Clarified it.
Okay. I'm glad you raised that point, because it actually does raise something very important about the nature of desire, which actually was explained to me by a psychotherapist, actually. So she was explaining to, I was in her class, she was explaining the difference between repression and acting out of emotion. And she said both of them are forms of avoidance. And what she meant by that was, so let me give it, so repression, obviously we can see. If an emotion comes up and it's repressed, it's not that it's suppressed. There's a difference between repression and suppression. Repression is actually not feeling it. That's an unconscious decision. It's not actually a consciously made. It's an unconscious decision. So if certain emotions are considered so dangerous to feel or express, they can be pushed down. So
they're pushed into the subconscious
where they cannot, and you don't even know you've got them.
Yes.
So, for example, if you live in a household, or you live in you don't have to live in a household. I can think, for example, if you are in an office where you have someone, a boss who's bullying you, to express some kind of dissatisfaction or anger will cause the bullying to increase. That makes your anger a danger to your survival. And so in the moment, you'll suppress it. You'll repress it. And it might not be till you get home and you open the door and you walk in and the dog comes bounding up to you, jumps up at you like this and knocks you, and you suddenly feel this fury and you go to strike the dog and the dog runs away. You think, where the hell did that come from? It came from earlier in the day when all that stuff was swept underneath the carpet, which had to be repressed because you weren't able in that circumstance to show. So that's what. So I just want to get. I want to give the other example now.
Yeah.
So the other example she said, but also acting out emotions is also a form of avoidance. And what she said that she had a client, one of her clients earlier in the week, who was telling her about how her boyfriend had been. She had this terrible row with the boyfriend and then had to split up and whatever. And she was telling her about it. And as she was telling her, She said, I could see she was becoming more and more agitated, and she was beginning to relive the whole thing. And she said, you could see it building up in her body like this, as she became more and more sort of animated with it. She said, and just as it began to reach a crescendo, she screamed. So there she was in the therapy room, talking with the therapist, and she hollered and screamed, in the therapy room. And she said, afterwards, it was all passion spent. But at the last moment, she had avoided coming into contact with that emotion. She had done that through that screaming. It had become too much to bear, and so she had acted it out. And she said, that's why in therapy, what they do is they get you to articulate it. But it's not just a case of a quiet articulation. It has to be articulated whilst you are experiencing the emotion. She said that is the way you actually process it. The other two are avoidance. And that's why the practice of restraint is also, we practice restraint in Buddhism, because it avoids those two extremes. It means that you don't repress, because you have to experience the emotion. You have to experience the desire. And that is done through thwarting it. And you also have to then experience the desire, not being carried away by it. You actually have to bear the emotional reaction as it happens. And that's where the strength, that's where the resilience is developed.
I would use the word surrender.
Yes, you can use the word surrender.
Surrendering to it without action, to observe and surrender.
Yeah,
Personally, yeah. The thing at the beginning, can I quickly?
Yeah.
You said there's these two positions.
Yes.
And I would say both are right and both are wrong. The issue is ego. If you hold either concept really tightly, it will stop you actually progressing. It's the looseness of a belief that it's not so tightly held that you can go forward. Which is where that's just a thought.
Yeah, the ego is the attachment to the view.
The position, and
yeah,
then becomes the problem.
Because the ego is not a thing. The ego is the attachment to the view.
Yeah.
So,
this is the word thing. Yeah.
And when that view evaporates, or when that view is sort of ground away, if you like, then the ego goes at the same time.
You talked about the star and different ways of becoming awakened. I think it's about pulling back, and it's like a pull-back state. So while you're in meditation, you're on a focus state, and then at the awakening, I think might be pulling back and an opening, like presence, because you talked about presence.
I use the term beholden. Behold.
Yeah, you use the concept, Eckhart Tolle concept, of bringing yourself into the now, and then open. So, samadhi, I don't know, is this the concept of thought, i.e. all being one?
It's the state of being at one.
But not the state of all being one, or all being one. Because I don't know samadhi, I have to research.
Yeah, okay. Samadhi is a description of the state of oneness that arises in the absence of self.
So you talked about all being one.
Yeah.
Do you see, if you pull that right back, all being one? Not all. All being one.
There's one. Okay. So the actual. So the actual. I think. Okay. Two things here, because again,
nothing is real, but everything is perception of as something. I'm trying to pull it right back.
Yeah.
No. Okay. We'll leave.
I think two. Okay. Just quickly a couple of things on that. First of all, the reason for the morning star, or the smell of the peach blossoms, or the pebble against the bamboo, is because in the end I cannot let go of myself. So that remember what I was saying about the aesthetic experience. So you see, you go out into nature and you see, a beautiful flowering tree or whatever, and there's a moment of, you don't do that, I don't do that. It's this state of being held by something, the aesthetic experience, is something that happens to us. And in the same way, that's why the Buddha, in a sense, needed the morning star. The morning star had to open him up. You talked about opening, but I can't do that to myself. No I can do that. Something has to come in to open that up, to open and to break that shell of I open. So that's why I'm likening it to that, using that word, to be beheld, to be held by something. And I think it was was it? Oh God, who was it? It was one of the Irish playwrights. Who wrote Ulysses? James Joyce. So James Joyce talks about this. He said that in true art, it opens us up. We are beheld by it. If we view it, he said, it becomes pornography, which might sound a little bit odd. But what he means is that it becomes transactional. Whereas in the aesthetic experience, it's something that we are at one with, captivated by, and therefore opened up by that experience. And that's what, in the case of the Buddha awakening, or with the other enlightenment experiences, those two things are necessary. That to be opened up is by the external event, the sound or the sight or whatever. That's what it becomes necessary. I cannot do it for myself.
No, I back to Eckhart Tolle a little bit. I don't know if you've read it.
I have.
The concept of naming things becomes the issue, which is what I think you're touching on as well. That's a tree.
Yeah.
Bring it back, they're not a tree at all. I think you're touching in that in a different way, but in a kind of sense. That star, he wasn't looking at it as a star when he awakened.
No.
It was.
Yeah, it
became a was rather than a star within that thing that happened.
Let's put it this way. A lot of these are sort of precursors. So when people start sitting meditation, they have some kind of object of meditation. Maybe the breath, maybe the count on the breath, maybe a mantra. But let's just take, because in Buddhism we either use the breath direct or we put a count on the out breath. That's the two most common ways. That's actually not meditation. That's the precursor for the meditation that happens when the count drops off. Because when the count drops off, or the following the breath drops off, something opens out. That open out, that's the samadhi, and that's the state of meditation. So samadhi is the state of meditation. Dhyana is the practice of meditation. So the practice of meditation is all the little techniques that you're given. This is how to practice meditation. Put your hands like this, put your legs like this, sit up with your back straight, have the eyes like this, mouth is closed, breathe in and out through the nose, tongue on the upper palate, behind the teeth, etc. None of that's meditation. None of it. It's all the foundational stuff that's needed. And then you have the breath and the out breath, and in Zen we put a count on the out breath. But that's still not meditation. When all that falls away and the state of samadhi opens, that's meditation. So naming things and all those little things that Eckhart Tolle gives, because I have read him, those are the things that will get you, those are all the precursor things that I can do, but I cannot meditate. I have to fall off, and then meditation happens. It's like I can't fall asleep. We lie down, we close our eyes, and if that eye can't drop off, then I lie there awake, just thinking about things. But there comes a point when suddenly there's a drop-off, and we enter into sleep. In meditation, the only difference is we don't become unconscious, we stay conscious. But that drop-off must occur. The drop-off of I occurs, and then samadhi, that's meditation. If you go and have a look at the Noble Eightfold Path, it's actually called right samadhi. Samadhi is the state of oneness. Okay, I think probably we should call it a day there because it's 9:15.
Dedication now.
Yes, please.
May whatever benefit arises from this practice go to the benefit of all sentient beings, stirred by the waves of birth, sickness, aging, and death. May they be free from the oceans of samsara.
Martin, thank you very much. What did you do whilst you were waiting for the train to take off again? Did you
Just stood out on the platform, looking around, waiting for someone to tell us what to do.
You didn't do any practice?
Doom scrolling.
Doom scrolling. No, I'm happy to say I did. I'm happy to say that I did.
Well, thank you very much. May we ask you to attend again this year?
Yeah,
Is it
yeah,
too
yeah,
short?
that's fine. Yeah. Okay, we'll sort it out today.
Very good. Okay, thank you
Thank
so
you very
much.
much. Okay.
Shall we have some refreshments?
Yeah, I think-
Plans?
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. All the best. Thank you.